Daniel walked slowly into the courtroom that morning, his steps heavy and uncertain. His shoes were worn thin, the soles almost coming apart. His coat was too big for him, with holes at the sleeves, and it hung loosely on his thin frame. His face looked older than his years, lined with the marks of hardship, and his beard was unshaven. To most people watching, he looked like just another homeless man who had lost his way in life. The whispers began almost as soon as he sat down at the defendant's table. People leaned toward each other, exchanging quiet remarks about his appearance, his smell, his condition. Nobody expected much from him. They thought he was simply another man who had made bad choices and ended up in trouble. But Daniel's story was not that simple. He had not always been broken. Years earlier, he had stood tall and proud in a uniform, carrying himself with the dignity of a soldier. He had served his country with honor, traveling far from home, facing danger so that others could live in safety. Yet none of that showed now. Time, pain, and neglect had covered his past like dust over an old photo. What people saw was only the present version of him, a man sitting quietly, too tired to lift his eyes from the floor. The charge was small, yet it carried weight for someone like him. Daniel had been arrested for trespassing in an abandoned building. The truth was he had nowhere else to go. The nights had turned bitter cold, and he had slipped inside the empty building to find shelter. There had been no harm in it, no theft, no fight. Just a man searching for warmth and a corner to rest his head. But laws did not always bend to sympathy, and so he had been brought here to stand trial before a judge. The bailiff called the room to order. The sound of his voice echoed sharply against the walls. Everyone rose, then sat again as the judge entered. The room carried the usual formality: lawyers in press suits, officers standing tall, papers rustling as clerks organized files. In the middle of it all, Daniel seemed like a shadow, small and forgotten. Even as his case was called, few people paid attention. They were thinking of their own matters, waiting for their own names to be read. Daniel stood when the judge asked him to. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and cracked, the kind of voice that comes from years of strain and little rest. "Yes, Your Honor," he said when asked if he understood the charge. It was barely more than a whisper. The clerk shuffled through the papers, ready to announce the details of the case, ready to reduce Daniel's life into a few cold lines of legal writing. As he waited, Daniel's mind wandered back to the night of his arrest. He remembered the sound of the wind howling outside the broken windows of the abandoned building. He remembered wrapping himself in his old coat, trying to hold on to a little warmth. He remembered the flashlight beam suddenly shining in his face, the voice of the officer telling him to get up, to come with them. He hadn't fought. He hadn't resisted. He had simply stood and gone quietly. In truth, he had almost felt relief. At least someone had noticed him, even if it was only to take him away. Back in the courtroom, Daniel lowered his eyes to the ground. He was used to being unseen. On the streets, people often passed him without a glance, or else stared with pity, or worse, with judgment. It no longer surprised him. What hurt more was the memory of who he once had been. There were nights he lay awake on park benches, remembering the days when his name had meant something, when his voice had carried strength, when he had led men through difficult times and returned home to applause. Those memories were sharp, like glass, cutting into his heart whenever they surfaced. The courtroom ticked forward with its rhythm. Questions asked, answers given, papers shuffled. But underneath the routine there was something stirring that nobody could yet see. Daniel himself did not know that his presence in this room was about to bring a wave of silence, then shock, then respect, unlike anything the courtroom had witnessed before. For now he only thought of how small he felt, how tired, how invisible. The prosecutor spoke, describing Daniel's trespassing. He used plain words, yet they felt heavy. The defendant entered the property without permission. He remained inside unlawfully. Daniel listened, though his heart sank further. Each word felt like a nail closing in a box around him. He wanted to explain, to say he had been cold, that he had only needed a safe place to sleep. But he also knew how little such words mattered in rooms like this. People rarely cared for the stories of men like him. They only cared for rules broken or laws kept. As he stood waiting, his eyes flickered briefly toward the audience benches. He saw a row of people, some bored, some curious, some indifferent. A few shook their heads when they looked at him as if to say, "What a waste." He quickly turned his eyes away. Shame burned inside him. He wanted to disappear, to walk out, to never be looked at again. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned his attention to the file in front of him. Daniel's full name was written across the page. The clerk was ready to read it aloud for the record. For Daniel, it was just a name, a sound he had lived with all his life. But for the judge, that name carried a weight he had not expected. At this moment, however, Daniel did not know this. He was still lost in his thoughts, still standing in silence, still feeling smaller than anyone else in the room. The minutes felt long. Every sound seemed louder, the tapping of a pen, the creak of a chair, the shuffle of feet. Daniel swallowed hard, waiting for whatever came next. He wondered if the judge would fine him, or send him to jail for a few nights. He did not think of mercy. He did not hope for kindness. He had learned not to expect such things anymore. But deep inside, under the layers of disappointment and weariness, there was still a faint spark of the man he had once been. It was buried, quiet, almost gone, but not gone completely. That spark was the memory of honor, of courage, of loyalty. It was the memory of brothers in arms, of nights under the stars with his unit, of the sound of a flag lifting in the wind. He carried it even now, though no one around him could see it. The courtroom only saw a broken man waiting for judgment. They did not yet know his name. They did not yet know the story that would make them rise to their feet in respect. For now, they only saw Daniel as he was at that moment, a homeless veteran standing quietly, his hands trembling, his eyes lowered, his soul heavy with the weight of years. And so, Part 1 closed in silence, with Daniel's presence in the courtroom unnoticed, his past unspoken and his true story waiting in the shadows, ready to change the room once his name was heard aloud. The judge lifted the file and glanced at the papers in front of him. He had read dozens of cases already that week, most of them ordinary, routine, unremarkable. But when his eyes fell on the name written at the top of the page, his hand stopped in mid-motion. The sound of the clerk's voice ready to read it aloud suddenly felt heavier than usual. The judge leaned forward slightly, squinting as if he needed to make sure he was seeing it correctly. The letters were clear, the spelling unmistakable. He read it again silently in his mind. Daniel James Walker. At first he wondered if it was coincidence. Names could repeat, after all. People shared names every day. But there was something about this particular one that pulled at his memory like a thread tugging on old fabric. His heartbeat slowed, and a faint sense of recognition swept through him. He lifted his gaze and studied the man standing in front of him. The veteran's clothes were torn, his posture bent, his face tired. He looked like a stranger, yet the name written on the page suggested a different story. "State your name for the record," the judge said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of curiosity. Daniel raised his head slowly. His eyes met the judge's only for a moment before sliding down again. "Daniel James Walker," he answered softly. The words came out rough, as if they hadn't been spoken in a long time. The courtroom grew unusually quiet. It was as though the air itself had shifted. The judge let the name roll around in his thoughts. Yes, he was sure now. This was no ordinary name. He had seen it before long ago in reports and letters that told stories of bravery in places most people never visited. His brother's stories came rushing back, stories he had shared late at night after returning home from service, speaking in a low voice about the man who had saved him when all seemed lost. His brother had said the name more than once. Daniel Walker. The judge cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the bench a little tighter. He leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, where did you serve?" he asked suddenly. His tone had changed. It was no longer the clipped voice of a man processing routine paperwork. It was the voice of someone trying to confirm a memory. Daniel hesitated. The question was not expected. Few people ever asked him about his past. Most only asked him about what he had done wrong in the present. He shifted uneasily, his eyes darting around the room as if to see if anyone else cared. "Army, Your Honor," he answered quietly. His shoulders stiffened a little, a reflex from years ago when discipline had been second nature. The judge nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth tightening. He pressed on. "And which unit?" Daniel hesitated again. The memories stirred like dust in an old room. "1st Battalion," he said after a pause. 32nd Infantry. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. The judge felt his breath catch in his chest. That was it. That was the name his brother had spoken, and that was the unit he had mentioned when telling the story of the night his life had been saved. It was no coincidence now. The man standing before him, dressed in rags and accused of trespassing, was the same man his brother had once described as a hero. The realization struck him so powerfully that for a moment he forgot the courtroom around him. The lawyers looked at each other, puzzled by the sudden change in direction. The clerk glanced up, confused as to why the judge was asking questions that seemed to have nothing to do with the trespassing charge. Even the spectators, who had been half distracted moments earlier, now leaned forward, sensing that something important was happening. Daniel stood still, unsure why his military past mattered here. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a curtain he had kept closed for years had just been pulled aside. He had learned long ago that most people didn't want to hear about service, sacrifice, or scars. They wanted neat explanations, not complicated truths. Yet here was a judge asking questions with an intensity that felt different. The judge's eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. "Mr. Walker, I need to ask you one more thing. Do you remember the night near Coast when your unit was ambushed?" Daniel's body tensed. That night was carved into his memory as deeply as a scar. He had relived it countless times, both awake and in dreams. The sounds of gunfire, the cries for help, the desperate scramble to save lives. All of it remained sharp even after so many years. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "Yes, Your Honor," he whispered. The judge exhaled, the truth now undeniable. His brother had told him of that same night. He had spoken of a soldier who ran back into danger, who pulled men to safety one after another, who refused to leave anyone behind even when the odds were against him. That soldier had been named Daniel Walker. The man standing in front of him was not just another defendant. He was that very man. A murmur spread through the courtroom as people realized something unusual was happening. The prosecutor closed his file, watching with curiosity. The defense attorney, who had barely spoken until now, leaned forward, his eyes wide. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stiffly by the wall, shifted slightly, sensing the shift in energy. The judge placed his papers down and removed his glasses. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer than before, almost trembling. "Mr. Walker, you don't know me, but I know you. Or at least I know what you did. My brother owes his life to you. He told me about you many years ago." Daniel froze. His tired eyes lifted, meeting the judge's gaze fully for the first time. A wave of confusion washed over him. "Your brother?" he asked, his voice shaking. The judge nodded, his face solemn. "He never forgot your name. And now here you are, standing in this courtroom." The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the air vents above. Everyone in the room could feel the weight of the moment, though few yet understood its full meaning. For Daniel, it was as though the world had tilted, after years of being unseen, unrecognized, judged only by his present condition. Someone had spoken of his past with respect. Someone had remembered. The judge sat back slowly, but his eyes never left Daniel's face. Around the room, people exchanged glances. The whispers grew louder, but they carried a different tone now. It was no longer the sound of judgment. It was the sound of curiosity, of shock, of realization that the man in front of them was not who they had assumed he was. Daniel's hands trembled slightly at his sides. His chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. The years of silence had built walls inside him, and now those walls were cracking. The courtroom was no longer ordinary. It had shifted into something rare, a place where truth and recognition met unexpectedly. Daniel had come in thinking he would be forgotten once again, just another case number to be processed. But as his name echoed in the judge's voice, the entire atmosphere changed. People could sense that the story unfolding was bigger than a trespassing charge. What none of them knew yet was that this moment would not end here. It was only the beginning of something greater. For Daniel, for the judge, and for every person watching, the courtroom was about to transform into a stage where forgotten honor would return to light. The man who had entered as a shadow was now stepping into recognition, though he himself did not yet realize how much respect his name would soon command. The courtroom was still. The judge's words hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said that morning. Daniel stood frozen, his body stiff, his hands trembling just enough for those close to see. He was used to silence, but this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of people ignoring him on the street. It was the silence of attention, sudden, sharp, and complete. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him. Daniel's mind raced. He hadn't expected any of this. He had walked into the courtroom that day believing it would be just another humiliation, a fine he couldn't pay, a short sentence he would quietly endure, or at best a dismissal that would leave him back on the streets. He had never imagined his name would bring the judge himself to pause, to speak of him as someone remembered, someone respected. The judge took a deep breath before continuing. His voice shook slightly, betraying emotions he usually kept hidden behind the bench. "My brother told me about you, Mr. Walker. He told me how in the darkest moment of his life, when his unit was under attack, you refused to leave him behind. He said you carried him through the chaos, even when it meant risking your own life." The judge's eyes softened, though his posture remained upright. "He never forgot your courage, and he told me if I ever met you, I was to thank you on his behalf." The room shifted again. Gasps rose from the audience. The lawyers, who had moments ago seemed bored with the case, now stared wide-eyed. The prosecutor, usually unshaken, leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed in surprise. The defense attorney blinked as if he could not believe his luck, his client suddenly being spoken of as a hero rather than a criminal. Even the bailiff's usual stiffness broke for a moment. His lips parted as he realized the man in front of them had once carried lives out of danger. Daniel lowered his head, unable to hold the judge's gaze any longer. His throat tightened and his eyes stung. He didn't like attention. He didn't want pity. But this was not pity, it was respect. Something he hadn't felt in years. Something he thought he would never feel again. The judge leaned closer. "Do you remember saving a man named William Anderson?" The name hit Daniel like a wave. He closed his eyes briefly and the memory burst alive in his mind. It was night, the air filled with smoke and fire. He remembered the cries of his fellow soldiers, the smell of dust and blood. He remembered seeing Anderson on the ground, injured, unable to move. And he remembered the weight of his body as he dragged him, stumbling through chaos, bullets slicing the air, refusing to let him die. Daniel's lips trembled. "Yes," he whispered. "I remember." The judge nodded slowly, his own eyes moist. "That man was my brother." A hushed ripple moved across the courtroom like a wave across water. Now the connection was clear to everyone. The judge wasn't speaking in abstract admiration. He was speaking about his own family. The man who had saved his brother's life was now standing in front of him in worn-out clothes, accused of nothing more than trying to find shelter. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He hadn't known. He had never thought about what happened to the men he saved after the war. To him, they had been comrades, brothers in arms, lives worth protecting no matter the cost. He had not sought thanks. He had not expected recognition. In fact, he had tried to bury those memories because they made the pain of his present feel even heavier. And yet here he was, hearing from the lips of a judge that one of those men's lives had touched this very courtroom. The spectators leaned forward. Some covered their mouths, unable to hide their emotions. Others wiped at their eyes quietly. The story was unfolding in front of them, and it was unlike anything they had seen in a courtroom before. The prosecutor, known for his strictness, finally broke his silence. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "this man is accused of trespassing. But if what you say is true..." His voice trailed off as though he realized the words were too small for the moment. The judge raised a hand gently, stopping him. "What I say is true, and this man deserves more than the label of defendant." Daniel stood quietly, his thoughts swirling. For years he had been reduced to labels: homeless, drifter, trespasser. Now, in a single moment, another label returned: hero. But it was hard for him to accept. His heart told him he was no hero, only a man who had done what needed to be done. He had saved others because he could not bear to leave them behind. He never expected glory. He never wanted it. But glory, once lost, seemed to have found him again in this unexpected place. The defense attorney finally rose, sensing the tide had shifted. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "it is clear Mr. Walker's actions in the past speak to his character far more than this unfortunate circumstance. He is not a criminal. He is a man who has fallen on difficult times, yes, but a man of honor." The judge nodded, though he kept his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Mr. Walker, the world may have forgotten your name, but not everyone has. And I think it is time the truth of who you are is recognized here." Daniel's knees felt weak. He wanted to sit, but pride kept him standing. His hands gripped the edge of the table for balance. Tears welled in his eyes, though he fought to hold them back. He had faced storms, battles, and hardships that would break many men, yet this recognition of his past, was somehow harder to endure. The audience remained silent, every ear tuned to the story. It was no longer a trial about trespassing. It had become a revelation. People who had walked in ready to dismiss Daniel as nothing more than another face in the system, now sat in awe. They were seeing with new eyes, seeing not just the man in front of them but the history he carried, the sacrifices he had made. Daniel lifted his head slightly. His lips parted, and though his voice cracked, he managed to speak. "I only did what any soldier would have done. I didn't want to leave anyone behind." The judge's face softened further. "Perhaps, but not everyone has the courage to act as you did. My family owes you a debt we can never repay." A hush followed those words. It was the kind of hush that comes when people realize they are witnessing a moment that will be remembered. Daniel shifted on his feet. He had never asked for repayment, never wanted recognition. Yet a part of him, a part long buried, felt a flicker of warmth. For years he had carried his past alone, invisible to the world. Now, in the most unlikely of places, that past had been brought into the light. And still, no one had moved yet. No one had clapped. No one had spoken. But something was building in the air. Something Daniel could feel in his chest, though he did not understand it yet. Respect was rising, quietly, powerfully, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. The courtroom was filled with silence so deep that even the faint hum of the overhead lights could be heard. Daniel stood trembling, unsure of how to carry the weight of what had just been said. His name had been spoken with respect again for the first time in years. The judge had revealed the truth, that the broken man standing in rags before them was the same soldier who had once carried lives out of danger, the same man who had saved his own brother. At first, no one moved. People simply stared at Daniel, their minds struggling to balance the picture they saw with the story they had just heard. To them, he had entered as a homeless man, another face lost to hardship. But now they saw more. Beneath the tired eyes and torn clothes was a man who had stood against fear and chosen sacrifice. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his knees threatening to give out. His hands gripped the table for support, but his head stayed bowed. He could feel their eyes, hundreds of them, staring, weighing, realizing. A heavy silence pressed on him, and he wished for it to end because he had never enjoyed attention, never liked being placed on a pedestal. He had done what he had done because it was his duty. Nothing more, nothing less. But the silence did not end. Instead, something else happened. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. A single person in the audience rose from their seat. It was an older man, his face weathered, his suit neat. He stood without a word, his hands clasped in front of him. The movement caught the eye of those nearby, and soon another stood. Then another, and another. Within moments, the sound of benches creaking filled the room. People rose to their feet, one after another, in silent unity. Soon the entire courtroom was standing. Not one person remained seated. It was not commanded. It was not planned. It was respect, rising naturally, powerfully, like a wave that no one could resist. Daniel lifted his head slightly, confused at first by the sound. His tired eyes scanned the room and saw them, every man, every woman, every spectator, lawyer, clerk, even the bailiff, standing tall. Their faces were solemn, respectful, some even emotional. They were not looking at him with pity now. They were looking at him with admiration. The judge, too, stood. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed back his chair and rose from the bench. His robe draped heavily at his sides, his eyes locked on Daniel. "This courtroom honors you today," he said softly, his voice breaking through the silence. "We honor the sacrifices you made when you were young, and the courage you carried when others would have run. You may feel forgotten, Mr. Walker, but let it be known, you are not forgotten here." Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. Tears blurred his vision. His chest ached as emotion flooded him. For years he had carried shame and silence, believing the world had cast him aside. He had grown used to invisibility. Yet here, in this unlikely place, he stood surrounded by respect that he never expected. His knees weakened again, but this time from the overwhelming force of gratitude he felt. People in the audience bowed their heads slightly, some with hands clasped, as though they were in the presence of something sacred. One woman wiped her tears quietly. A young man near the back pressed his hand to his heart. Even the prosecutor, who had entered the case with indifference, looked down at his desk, struggling with emotion. Daniel whispered, though his voice was so soft that only those closest could hear, "I don't deserve this." The judge leaned forward. "You deserve more than this, and you deserve better than the life you've been forced to live in recent years. You gave your youth, your strength, your peace of mind for others. That is not something this nation or this courtroom can overlook." The words struck deep. Daniel shook his head lightly, still overwhelmed. He wanted to tell them that he had only done his duty, that he had only followed the voice of conscience, that he had only wanted to save his brothers. But every attempt to form words collapsed in his throat. His heart was too full. The standing audience remained silent, but the silence itself spoke louder than any applause. It was not a silence of emptiness. It was a silence filled with meaning, with unspoken gratitude. Daniel could feel it in his bones, the collective weight of their respect pressing on him in the gentlest way. Minutes seemed to stretch. No one sat down. Daniel realized then that this moment was not just about him. It was about all the forgotten men and women like him, those who had served, those who had given, those who had been left behind in silence. The respect rising in the room was for him, yes, but it was also for them. He closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment he could see the faces of his fellow soldiers, some alive, some gone. He imagined them standing here too, shoulder to shoulder, lifting him up when he could not stand alone. The thought gave him strength. Finally, the judge spoke again. His voice was steady, carrying across the room. "This man came into our courtroom today accused of trespassing. But let us not forget, he trespassed once more in his life long ago into danger itself when no one else would. And he did it to save lives. The difference is clear." A murmur of agreement moved through the audience, though still no one sat. Their standing posture had become a silent promise to honor him, to remember him. Daniel swallowed hard. He raised his head fully this time, his eyes red with tears, but his posture straighter than before. "Thank you," he managed, his voice broken but clear enough to be heard. "Thank you. But I only did what I had to do. I couldn't leave anyone behind." The judge nodded. "And that is exactly why this courtroom stands for you today." Daniel's heart pounded. For years he had been invisible. Now he felt seen. Not just seen, but recognized for the man he truly was. The years of pain, the nights of loneliness, the cold mornings of hunger. They did not vanish, but for this moment they were covered by something greater. Honor. He glanced around the room once more. He saw faces filled with respect, strangers who looked at him not as a broken man, but as someone worth admiring. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the weight of shame lift, replaced by a lightness he had forgotten existed. The silence held for a while longer, until finally the judge gently motioned for the court to sit. Slowly, people lowered themselves back into their seats, though their eyes never left Daniel. The respect lingered in the air, unbroken. Daniel sat down too, though his legs trembled as he did. His heart still raced, his hands still shook. But his spirit felt steadier than it had in years. For once he felt less like a shadow, and more like a man standing in the light. What had begun as a simple trial over trespassing had transformed into something larger, something unforgettable. The courtroom had become a place not just of law, but of recognition, of humanity, of honor. And though Daniel did not yet know it, this moment would mark the beginning of change, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The air in the courtroom still carried the weight of what had happened. Even after everyone had sat down again, their eyes stayed on Daniel. Something had shifted forever. What began as a simple case had become a moment of truth that touched every heart in the room. Daniel sat trembling, still trying to understand the respect he had just received. For years he had been invisible. Now, in the most unlikely place, he had been seen and honored. The judge looked at Daniel thoughtfully. His voice was steady but warm as he said, "Mr. Walker, this court is not blind to your past nor to the hardship you face now. You are not a criminal. You are a man who has sacrificed much, and what you need is not punishment but support." The prosecutor, usually known for his harsh approach, nodded quietly. For once there was no argument. The defense attorney, still stunned by the turn of events, spoke with passion. "Your Honor, I believe this case should be dismissed. This man deserves help, not a sentence." The judge agreed. With a firm yet emotional tone, he declared, "The charges against Daniel James Walker are dismissed. He will not be punished for seeking shelter. Instead, I ask that we, as a community, recognize our duty to help him stand again. The sound of the gavel striking the block echoed through the courtroom. But this time it did not sound like judgment. It sounded like a door opening to a new beginning. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was so faint, yet the gratitude in it was clear. For him, the dismissal of the charges was more than freedom. It was a reminder that he still mattered. As the hearing ended, something unusual happened. People did not simply gather their things and leave. Instead, many of them stayed. A man in the audience walked up to Daniel and offered his hand. "Thank you for your service," he said firmly. Another followed. Then another. Soon Daniel found himself surrounded by people he had never met, each one shaking his hand, each one expressing gratitude. Some offered more than words. They spoke of housing programs, veteran support groups, job opportunities. A woman pressed a card into his palm with the number of a shelter that helped former soldiers rebuild their lives. Daniel was overwhelmed. For so long he had asked for nothing but to be left alone, believing no one cared. Now, all at once, help was being placed in his hands. He felt dizzy, unsure how to accept it, unsure if he even deserved it. But the sincerity in their eyes told him this was real. The judge came down from the bench after the session closed. He stood directly before Daniel, his expression solemn but kind. "Mr. Walker," he said, "my family owes you everything. Without you, my brother would not be alive today. I will personally make sure you get the help you need." Daniel's eyes welled with tears. His voice shook as he replied, I didn't even know he lived. I just did what I had to do." The judge placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that is why you deserve this respect. Because you never sought recognition, but your actions speak louder than words." Outside the courthouse, the story began to spread. Reporters who had come for routine cases now carried headlines about the homeless veteran whose bravery had once saved lives and who had been honored in a courtroom. The story touched hearts beyond the walls of that building. Strangers who read about him reached out to offer support. Veterans groups rallied to provide housing and medical care. Offers of employment came from people who respected his courage and wanted to see him rebuild. Daniel at first struggled to accept it. Years of hardship had taught him to be cautious, to expect little. But slowly he began to allow himself to hope again. He met with a counselor who helped him face the memories he had long buried. He found a bed in a safe shelter, not just for a night but as a step toward stability. Volunteers helped him replace his worn coat with warm clothes that fit. For the first time in years, he slept in a real bed with a blanket that was clean and soft. Days turned into weeks, and each day Daniel felt a little stronger. The weight of shame began to lift, replaced by a sense of belonging. He discovered that people still valued him, not only for his past but for who he was now. He began to share his story with younger veterans, reminding them that even in their darkest times they were not alone. His words, spoken with quiet sincerity, carried a power born from experience. The judge kept his promise. He stayed in touch, checking on Daniel's progress, making sure opportunities opened for him. The bond formed that day in the courtroom became something lasting, built not just on gratitude but on respect. One afternoon, months later, Daniel stood in front of a small group at a community center. He wore a clean shirt, his hair trimmed, his posture stronger than before. He spoke softly, telling his story, not to glorify himself, but to remind others that life could change, that hope could return even after years of despair. The people listening nodded, some with tears, some with pride. Daniel no longer walked with his head bowed. He had been given a second chance. More importantly, he had been given back his dignity. He never forgot that morning in the courtroom, when the world had seen him not as a trespasser, not as a homeless man, but as the soldier who once carried others through fire. That moment stayed with him, a turning point that reminded him of who he truly was. The courtroom had stood for him, but in truth, it had stood for every forgotten veteran, every unseen hero. Daniel carried that lesson forward. Whenever he shook a fellow veteran's hand, whenever he looked someone in the eye and said, "You still matter," he remembered the day the world had said the same to him. And though his life was far from perfect, it was no longer empty. He had shelter, he had people who cared, and most importantly, he had hope. The trial that could have marked his downfall had instead become his rebirth. It was the day respect returned, the day he discovered that even after years of silence, the world still had the power to honor its heroes. Daniel James Walker, once forgotten, was forgotten no more.